Hello, and welcome to this video, the next session in our Genesis series. And today we're going to be talking about Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. And we'll just jump right in and get to the meat of the lesson. And as we notice that today we're talking about Genesis 1, 3, where it says, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." So let's clear up a first initial uh, conception problem that many people have of this verse and this passage. And many people believe if you ask them, they'll say, well, what was the first thing God created? And they'll say light. And I'm going to propose to you that if you're on a quiz show, Jeopardy or something like that, go ahead and go with that as your answer. But if you want a deeper truth, then I would suggest that you consider our last couple of lessons. And we see that the very first things that God actually created were the heaven domain and the earth domain. And we know that there was other things that were created first as well. For example, the earth domain was created in a formless and void state, meaning that it was in its raw state of elements, raw substances, the periodic table, if you will, the elements, and the framework of it. However, it wasn't formed, it hadn't taken shape yet, and it was not populated yet. That hence the word void. That's all that means, unpopulated. So we can infer from that that the heavenly domain was fully formed and fully populated. All the angels and God's throne room and the third heaven where he dwells, he chose to create that space not for him, he doesn't need a place to dwell in, but for us to eventually join him and have the opportunity to join him in the third heaven. And but in order to facilitate free will and choice, he creates two domains, the other one being the earth. And as we already talked about, that's created in the raw state. And its elemental physical properties, the raw substance of the earth domain is created here. However, the rest of it takes shape over the course of creation's week. The week of creation, the 6 days of creation, the seventh day of rest, where he imposes a repose upon the order and form that he had created. Now, we know that there's some other things here. For instance, we talked about it last time, darkness. If you look at Isaiah 45, verse 7, we see clearly that God is the one who actually created darkness. Now, there's no darkness in him. However, he created darkness, and we talked about that last time. Go look at that video if you want more details on that. But the purpose for darkness is essentially to facilitate free will and relationship. Because if he hadn't imposed darkness in this shrouding himself in darkness, if he hadn't done that, then we would all have no choice but to believe in him, because there'd be nowhere that you could go in the universe where you wouldn't see him in his glorious majesty. And in a mortal frame, basically seeing him in his glorious majesty would turn us all into grease spots. And so, out of love and out of the desire for free will and true love and real relationship, he created this shroud of darkness essentially to protect creation and protect us from him and his uh, majestic glory, full of his light. And so, in order to like I said, create and facilitate free will and true love and true relationship, he shrouds himself in darkness. Go look at our last video if you want more details on that. And then we also see that there's another thing that's there in the raw, and we have the deep, excuse me, which is the same thing as the waters. Okay, so we have water, so one of the most simple molecules, H2O. We have a massive amount of water. We also talked about that in the last video, referenced here as the deep and, of course, as the waters. And so if you think about what the first things God created are, there's a whole bunch of things. There's the heaven domain, completely created, fully formed, fully populated in a moment, an instant of time. And then you have the earth domain, which is created in the raw, because he is going to create it over the space of time. And so he's going to create it in a particular order, and it's also created in a particular prophetic order. And if you want more information on that, you can check out my book, Creations Week, where I go over the prophetic implications of the order of the days of creation. Each day has a prophetic overtone which speaks to that 1,000-year period of creation's history. So we finally get to light. Now, I will also say this, that there's a big misconception about this one, and that is that God even created light. Because it's actually the one thing in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 which he did not create. He actually did not create light, and I'm going to explain that here. And I want you to understand that if we look at 1 John 1:5, we'll see that we get one of the handful of definitions of God that we find in Scripture. It says, "This then is the message which we have heard of him, and declare unto you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." But here, let's just focus on this, that God is light. There's a few of these in Scripture. One, in John 4:24, we learn that God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. We also know that God is love. We also know that he is the way, the truth, and the life. So God is love. God is spirit. God is light. God is the way. God is truth, and he is the life. And so in him are all of these qualities. So if we understand that, and we look at that definition, one of the definitions defining God in the Scripture, we would say, well, did God create light? Well, if he created light, that would mean that some aspect of him was created. And we know that God is eternally self-existent and eternally self-sufficient. He has no need of his creation, and therefore, if he created light, that would be kind of like saying he created himself, because God is light. And so what I would suggest to you as a better way of stating this would be that actually God manifested light. He manifested light, and I'll show you why I believe that here with our tools. Okay, so let's look at the Hebrew here, and we'll get a picture of this. And we'll say here, we see and. Again, that's the vav conjunctive here. And so that vav conjunctive is appended to the word said, amar. So you see that here, amar. Here's the word, and it's appended to that with the and there, and we see the and God said. So that's how that grammatical function works there in the Hebrew. And notice he says here, let there be, haya, let there be, and then we finally come to the word light. Let there be light, and that's the Hebrew word or. That's the English transliteration of it. You can also think of it, it's kind of where we get our term in the English aura. Like you imagine this kind of invisible light enveloping a person, kind of their, people talk about it as, their essence or their aura, their light, that is kind of latently there present with them. You can't see it, but you sense this aura about them. Some people might want to get into that, but we got to be careful about that, because that's it also sounds like a bunch of New Age talk, which we're not about here at all. Nevertheless, just helping you kind of get the idea of the Hebrew word or for light. Now, notice this, it says, and let there be light. So he says, let it be, or let light be, and then it just says, and there was light. So as I started this video with the object lesson of the light bulb in my mouth, he just spoke it, and it was. Now, you might be surprised to find out that that's the only time in the creation account where that happens. It doesn't happen anywhere else. And you might say, I know that's wrong. I know that's incorrect because it says, let there be a firmament. And he says, let there be lights in the heavens, and let there be this, and let there be that. I know you're wrong. You must be wrong. No, I'm not wrong, and I'll show you right now. Let's look at verse 6. And we're going to be getting into this in a future lesson, but let's just look at it for the sake of the wording here. Notice here it says, and God said, let there be, just like he said, let there be light, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters and so on, right? But let's just focus on this one part right here. Let there be a firmament. And does it say, and there was a firmament? No. What does it say in the next verse? And God made the firmament. Okay, so notice this. When you look at that, you'll see that God made, here's the word asa. Now, we looked at the word bada in a previous lesson. The word bada means to create out of nothing. The word asa means to form and shape something, to create it out of existing substance. So here he's making the firmament, the sky, essentially, out of elements and particles and things in the raw that he had already created on day one out of the earth domain that he had created. So he's forming and shaping something, the sky, the firmament. He's forming and shaping the blue vault, or the, as they might say in the King James, or the firmament, or the expanse, the great expanse, what we would call the sky, or in scientific terms, we might call the atmosphere. So as he's doing that, notice he's forming and shaping something out of existing substance. Whereas in the other term, bada, he's creating something out of nothing, out of no existing substance. And so the key here, though, is to really acknowledge this fact. Notice that in verse 6 it says, God said, let there be a firmament. And then in verse 7 it says, God made the firmament. So here we see this is different from light, because it just says, let there be light, and there was light. He didn't make it. He didn't asa it. He didn't bada it. It just was. And so let's look at a few more examples here. Let's go to here, for instance, talking about light. Let's go to verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament. Okay? So now we're talking about the celestial objects, the sun, moon, and stars. And notice, though, that after he said this, let's go down to verse 16 and see. And God made two great lights. Again, here we have asa. So he's forming and shaping these two great lights out of existing substance, out of material that already existed. And so when we see that and we understand that, and you can go through the whole rest of this chapter and see that everywhere where it says, and God said, let there be this, or let this be, and let this come into existence, it is always followed up by a verse where it says, and God made, or formed, or shaped the thing which he called into existence. But the one unique verse where you do not find that companion verse is verse 3, where it just says, let there be light, and there was light. And what I'm going to suggest to you is this, that as that happened, remember that darkness was there first. Here it clearly says darkness was upon the face of the deep. We know that God created darkness from Isaiah 45, verse 7. And again, my teaching on that is that he did that to protect his creation and us from his unbearable glory and majesty, while the earth and its coming population were still in their free will choice stage of existence. And so remember that God wanted to facilitate a true relationship, a relationship based on faith, and a relationship based on love and based on free will choice rather than based on force. And you must believe in me because here I am. Look at me in my mighty glory. You have no choice but to believe in me because I'm always there and I'm always observable and I'm always present visibly and undeniably in your face with my um, just heart-stopping glory. And so, in order to facilitate free will, and in order to facilitate love and relationship and faith, he shrouds himself behind a veil of darkness in the third heaven. But then he's not going to leave us in complete darkness. So what he does is he manifests a measure of his light into the earth domain realm. It's the first thing he does. Okay, so he manifests an essence of light of himself into this earth domain so that there would be a balance. And that's very important because as you see here, in verse 4 and 5, which we'll talk about in more detail in the next session, but real quick, let's just say, and God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. So there's a distinction. He's basically cut through the darkness with his light, and he measured out a certain amount of the light that he manifested from his very nature, his very essence, into the earth domain so that we could see there's two distinct properties or characteristics. Two distinct properties and characteristics, light and darkness. And we have the opportunity to hide from him in the darkness and abuse the blessing that he gave us in shielding us from himself in his true absolute state of glory and majesty. And there's people who look at the light and they see the light and they love the light and they want more. They want to increase the amount of light in their lives and they want to increase their capacity to be in his light, to want more of his light, and so on and so forth. So as you see that first distinction there, well, actually, I will call it really the second distinction, because you had heaven and earth, two distinct realms, and then you have darkness and light, two distinct characteristics within the earth realm. And so when you start to kind of see that, the understanding of this first day of creation starts to take a little bit better shape. And then notice that he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening, notice that comes first, and the morning were the first day. So again, think of evening as the darkness, and morning or the daytime as the light. And so if you see that, we're going to talk about this next time, but you can see words mean different things and they have different levels of meaning. So for instance, we see heaven, the first time heaven's used, it's talking about the third heaven. And later on, when we see the word heaven used again, it's going to be talking about the sky and the celestial heavens, the first and second heavens. So you see that the word cascades down to lesser manifestations of its ultimate definition. And that's true of the earth too. We see the ultimate definition of the earth is used first, and then later on we're going to see it cascades down to lesser manifestations of the same word, earth, but it means lesser and lesser manifestations of that ultimate manifestation. So when you see that, it starts helping you kind of piece all this together and understand it in greater detail. So now, with that said, I hope that gets you off on the right track of understanding this more correctly, more accurately, and so on and so forth. But I promised something in the previous videos, and I want to I'm going to touch on it here and give you a detailed explanation of it, and I'm also going to get back to it in greater detail when we do get into Genesis 1:14 through 18. Okay, so when we get into Genesis 1:14 through 18, we will reiterate this, maybe in some greater detail and add some new meaning to it. But I want to get to this part because it's very important. This is actually one of the biggest things that keeps a lot of people away from faith. And they believe in this monolithically unassailable paradigm of understanding because they believe science and scientists, secular science and secular scientists, who just claim absolutely without any doubt it can't be challenged. It's an unassailable truth, so called, but it's not true, that the universe is 14 billion years old. And I want to get to some deep truths here and help you to be able to believe in the truth of the Bible. And I want you to be able to also defend your belief of the truth in the Bible with scientific facts and data. And really, what it comes down to is a paradigm of understanding. Because people have a paradigm of understanding that subtracts God from the creation and the existence that we have around us and that we are in the midst of. And then you have a paradigm of understanding that takes God for granted, that people believe that absolutely God created everything. And then you really have a third group of people which take for granted that God created everything, but they listen because they're scared and they're intimidated. They listen to so-called smart people who say, "Oh, we can prove this with science. It's undeniable. It's absolute and unchallengeable, an unassailable truth. We know it, and we can prove it with a bunch of technical mumbo jumbo. And we have all these big fancy words and all these scientific understandings, and you don't. So you better listen to us, because if you don't, you're just an idiot." Well, first of all, I'm here to tell you that I've been a part of the scientific community, been interested in science and engineering my whole life. And I didn't go into that field, but I have been very much a follower of scientific discovery and engineering principles. And I love to study it. I love, as a hobby, to check it out and be especially on the cutting edge of these arenas. And I'll tell you flat out that the vast majority of these scientists, the vast majority of them, are no smarter than you or I. They're no smarter than the average person. They might have a higher IQ, and remember, IQ is mostly a measure of spatial intelligence and pattern recognition and mathematical ability. And so they might be pretty good at math and pretty good at equations and so on and so forth. But the vast majority of them are no smarter than the average Joe. But here's how they sound smart. See, there's very few, precious, precious few in the field of science and math and all the rest of those fields. There's very precious few who really look at the deep underpinnings of everything that they believe. What most of them are people who've been, I will use the word indoctrinated into a paradigm of understanding from a very small handful of actually really smart people. So there's a very small handful of actually really, really smart people, Einstein level people, and people who have a tremendous intellect and a gift for real high intellect and really deep thinking and doing all kinds of really deep experiments to test their theories, to actually come up with theories in the first place, and to actually have the level of intelligence to analyze and synthesize analyze existing data and existing theories and synthesize more refined versions of those theories or different theories on their own. Uh, the vast majority of them do this, and this is the absolute truth. They get indoctrinated in college, in school, high school and college, into the paradigm of understanding that came roughly between 1860 and 1940. There was a paradigm of understanding that started uh, looking at the scientific method and science by subtracting God from the equation. Let's take God out of it and let's only look at what we can see and what we can know. And we're going to try to explain everything just based on natural observations and inferences that we make from those observations. That's the only thing that we're going to do, and anybody who takes a different approach or believes in God is just a moron. And so we can go back in history and look at some unbelievable mistakes that they've made. For instance, I was reading one today about a particular scientist in 1941 who just declared, even though all the data at the time that they had, and all the discussions and all the papers that were being written by all the scientists of the day and age, but he was considered to be the keeper of the constants, is what his title was. And he just declared in a paper in 1941 that the speed of light is an absolute constant, and that's the end of it, period. No discussion. We are going with that model of understanding, that framework of understanding, and that paradigm of understanding, period, because I said so. And that became the standard by which all of modern science, let's say 20th century and 21st century science, has been indoctrinated by, even though it has now been proven that that is false. Okay, all cutting edge science people know that the speed of light is not an absolute constant, and that as it's not an absolute constant, that creates a huge problem for the paradigm of understanding that the vast majority of scientists operate within. And keep in mind, most of these scientists are no more intelligent than you or I. They might be a little bit better at math or science, equations, and spatial reasoning and thinking. They might be a little bit smarter in that, but nothing like the problem with society at large is we have elevated them to some um, giant status that we just think, oh, these super smart people, they've decided this, and therefore it can't be challenged. When actually there is a group of just as intelligent, I would say more intelligent scientists who take God for granted. They believe in Him, they believe in the Bible, and they are looking at a paradigm of understanding that actually puts God at the center of the understanding of how the universe came to be, and then they base all of the data and the findings on that truth. And so, as you think about that, it's very important to understand that the concept of the speed of light as a measurement with which we determine the age of the universe and therefore the age of the earth and the age of substances and different archaeological finds and so on and so forth. It's kind of complicated, but it basically boils down to this. It boils down to they look at the oscillation of electrons in elements, atoms. And they say, for instance, the cesium atom is the atom that is used for what we call the atomic clocks because it ticks off very precisely, very measuredly, very accurate seconds. For instance, like quartz, it does the same thing, just not nearly as precise. That's why if you have a quartz watch, it'll lose time over the course of a month or 2 months, and you'll have to keep resetting it if you want your time to stay accurate. Well, a cesium atom is extremely precise, and so with its precision, you can mark off time in seconds with extreme precision and pristine accuracy, and you can be very, very, very precise. However, Remember in 1941, there was a guy who came along and said the speed of light's an absolute constant for all time. And guess what the speed of electrons are in their orbits around the nucleus of atoms? Well, it goes at the speed of light. And so when you think about that, and you think about the speed of light is the same speed at which electrons are oscillating in their orbits around the nucleus of their atoms, then you start thinking, well, and here was the thought process. Well, if the speed of light is an absolute constant, which it's not, and they knew it wasn't back in 1941, this guy just declared it. And then because the speed of light is very consistent and very measurable and has become more measurable in the later 20th century and the 21st century, we can look at that and we can say, oh, okay, so if an atom is oscillating at this amount, and we study the radiometric data of this substance, and we see its radioactive half-life and other properties and characteristics it has, decay rates and so on and so forth, and we measure them based on our understandings now, we can therefore extrapolate back in history that at that exact same rate it's been going for since the beginning of time. And if it's been going at that same exact rate since the beginning of time, therefore, we can infer that the universe is 14 billion years old. And if you go by atomic time, based off of the current rate of the oscillation of electrons and atoms, that would actually be absolutely correct. And so they have a very good measurement to try to be super precise. However, let's see how God determined. We're going to look at this again, like I said, in a future session. But let's just look real quick at Genesis 1:14. And it says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and here we go, and for days and years. So, orbits of the sun and the moon and how those orbits are cyclical on a yearly basis and a monthly basis, God put those in place to measure days and years. So there's scientists out there who decided that they were going to use the speed of light and the oscillation of electrons to measure days and years. Well, what if the speed of electrons and the speed of light have not always been constant? Well, now you are trying to measure something with an instrument that is a moving instrument. It's like trying to measure something with a moving target, and you can't do it. And because they've done it, and they discerned that this must be an absolute constant throughout time, they have made this monstrous error. It's an error of monstrosity. In their goal to try to be more precise, they actually ended up being monstrously off in monstrous error. And so a laughable error. And so it's really actually quite hilarious how off they are because they were trying to be more precise. And this gets into the whole debate of there's a desire in the realm of physics and science to find a universal theory of everything where they can get the quantum physics to agree with we'll call it the macro universe. And so we'll just say the E equals MC squared world to agree with the quantum physics world, because our observations are that they absolutely don't agree with our current understandings. And so people are trying to find a way to mesh these two together and come up with the so-called theory of everything. And it hasn't been done yet, because they're coming at it from a wrong perspective. And so let's look at, I'm going to show you something here, and what has been found by one of the preeminent physicists in this domain. His name is Barry Setterfield, and I want to show you his chart. And he has done it's basically his life's work. He has studied something called the ZPE, zero point energy. In brief, what this is they found that there was this bare vacuum, and they tried to say, well, if we get this vacuum going and we have um, we get this space, and inside of this space there's no substance, there's no air, there's no anything in it, and as there's nothing in it and it's sealed and perfectly insulated, we'll call that a vacuum because there's nothing in it. Well, um, later on in the 20th century, they started studying it and they started realizing, well, wait a minute, we still detect heat, light can traverse it. We still detect this. We still detect that there's something in there. And so they had another idea to cool it down to absolute zero, negative 273 degrees Kelvin. And as they brought it down to absolute zero temperature, they noticed that there was still energy inside of it. And this became known as what is called the zero point energy, or ZPE. And so when you study the ZPE, as Max Planck did, by the way, one of the most brilliant physicists and scientists who ever lived, definitely rivals Einstein. I actually think that Planck was more profound in his research and his findings than Einstein was. But nevertheless, Max Planck, brilliant physicist, also devout Christian, by the way, a devout Christian. And as Max Planck discovered that there had to be a reason that his constant, called Planck's constant, worked. Because he just found that there's this thing that you plug in, and if you plug in this missing piece, it makes all the equations work. It makes all these things, you know, balance out in all these equations, and everything seems to make sense. But he didn't want just some random number like the golden ratio, or some mathematical number like e or pi or something. Like you just plug this in, Planck's constant, and it makes everything balance out and work. But he wanted to know, well, there's got to be a reason for that. There has to be a reason that that is so. And he found it in the zero point energy. And in his later work, he corrected his theoretical Planck's constant and replaced it with a physical, a metaphysical, a physiological reason why his constant worked. And this started the debate between what's known as QED physics and SED physics, stochastic electrodynamic physics. And so this SED physics world, um, it became known, but the QED physics world had already been established, and everybody, the vast majority of scientists and physicists today, are still using QED physics when SED physics has actually demonstrated the actual physical reasons of why Planck's constants Planck's constant works in the first place. And so, based on Barry Setterfield's research, which is still ongoing, it's not ultimately conclusive. However, you can go read all of his work on his website. It's really fantastic. If you have a mind for science and math and engineering and you like to know how things work, you can go read it. But he basically has analyzed the redshift data, which is the data that has come in from all the stars over the past decades, and they've measured the redshifts data between all these different stars and galaxies in the celestial heaven, and they've looked at it and they've analyzed it, and people have had different theories about the redshift for many years. But Barry Setterfield has come out with a all the data charted out, and all the data perfectly um, laid out, and he's let the data drive his theory, which is very um, accurate, and also it lines up perfectly with Scripture. And I would say that it's a very close model to what actually happened in the creation account, where God was creating the heaven and the earth. So if we look at this, let's notice a few things. And what he's done is he's agreed with scientists by saying if the oscillations of atoms, as they are now, had been that exact same constant rate throughout history, then absolutely you would be at roughly 14 billion years. So he acknowledges that. However, he's saying that's based on what he calls atomic time, as you can see here, atomic time. However, because he's noticed that the ZPE was much lower in the past, therefore there was much less interference in the orbits of electrons around their nuclei. As he noticed that ZPE was much lower in the past, the speed at which atoms oscillate, and therefore also the speed of light, was 10 to 100 million times faster at the creation. So, through a massive amount of geologic data and redshift data and all of his work, he has reconciled this chart so that you can see that what he calls orbital time. Notice this: geological eras and atomic clock conversions to orbital time. So what you can do is you can see this creation week here. He labels that as the 0 year, when God started creating the heaven and the earth. And then for the first roughly 500 years after creation, that was the time period of 8 to 4.5 billion years. And then he has this next 500-year period, or I'm sorry, next 200-year period is the speed of light, and electrons are slowing down more and more. And it's about the 3.8 billion mark where we see what we call the Earth domain, and what we call, what people look at and say, oh, the Earth is 4 point something billion years old. Well, when was that? That was around this time period. When was this? I'm going to suggest to you that this is the event where God created heaven. Um, and so therefore I think it's a little bit off in terms of years before Christ, but he created the heaven domain and fused the heaven domain to the earth domain, and that's what you're seeing here. Then we get into, the time of um, the actual creation week itself. So I think his eras here are maybe a little bit off, but I would call creation week when he's creating the actual waters of the deep, manifesting light into the creation, creating the firmament and the sky, bringing off the land from out of the midst of the seas, and all the rest of it. I believe this all kind of points to creation week. And so as it points to creation week, roughly when we get to this point here, you're talking roughly around the time on the day 6 when Adam was created. And so when you have Adam created there, you can kind of chart it from that point forward and see that it matches up with the biblical account very clearly. And then when you see here, when they say 900 to 600 million years ago, based on atomic time, not orbital time, um, we can see that that really is about this far, little, somewhere between here and here, the time of Noah's flood. And so when you see Noah's flood come on the scene, you can see that you can date that according to his dates here. And we see that because remember that we have to put Adam in there. Okay, so Adam isn't here. That's not where Adam shows up. Adam isn't even here. That's not where Adam shows up. Adam probably shows up sometime between here and here. And so, and so I think if you look at the very, very early stages, I think his chart maybe needs a little bit of explanation and more modification. But when Adam shows up sometime around here on the end of creation week, the end of that first 6 days, then if you subtract that from this, where 1656 in the Bible, that goes by from the time from Adam all the way up to the time of Noah at the flood, it matches perfectly with the biblical account. And so then if you go on from here and you look at all these things, you can see that the speed of light is slowing down, slowing down, slowing down, slowing down. So what they say is, 500 million years ago or 400 million years ago is actually what we would call um, that's what we would call, like, here's the column where it's BC dates. That's what we would call like 3400 BC, 3300 BC, and so on and so forth. And then you have another catastrophe. So you had the flood as a catastrophe. Then you have um, the Babel catastrophe, where God comes down and confuses the language. And then you have the Peleg catastrophe, where it says in Genesis 10:25 that the earth was divided, and this is where all the continents started to split up, and the massive earthquakes and the catastrophe that happened at that time period is right around where you have Peleg being there. And so as you get on from there, you notice that you hear this all the time, 65 million years ago, blah, 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 65 million years ago. You'll hear that a lot in geology. Well, no, that was actually, roughly 23,000 to 2,900 BC, and all the way down to 2,800 to 2,300 BC, when all these time periods were traversing. Of course, with the speed of light shrinking and getting slower and slower and slower and slower since the moment of creation, you have the ZPE increasing, therefore the speed of light is slowing down, and the proportion in which they do that is proportional. So the proportion of the speed of light in Planck's constant to the speed of light slowing down and ZPE increasing is an absolute constant. And that's what the guy in 1941 was banking on. He was banking on, well, when you plug in all the numbers, it still comes out as an absolute constant. Yes, an absolute constant, the ratio between the speed of light and the ZPE in Planck's constant, that is an absolute constant. Because as one goes up, the other one goes down. And so it is an absolute constant. Just like you can take the number 12, right? You can take the number 12. How do you get it? Well, you can get it 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4, 4 times 3, 6 times 2, and 12 times 1. You can arrive at 12 all kinds of different ways. And so he was counting on the 12. Well, the 12 is always 12. However, the 2 and the 6 were not always the same. The 3 and the 4 were not always the same. The 6 and the 2 were not always the same. And so if you're looking at just the one part of the equation, the speed of light, that's the only thing you're looking at, and you're saying that's an absolute constant, it's not, because it was 1, then it was 2, then it was 3, then it was 6, or then it was 4, then it was 6, and then it was 12. And so if you look at it like that, you can see that if you're just taking one piece of the puzzle, the speed of light, and trying to impose an absolute constant throughout the history of time on it, it's not true. And so if you understand that, then you can start getting into the truth of the matter, which is that right around 2800 BC, that's when the speed of light normalized. And he has charts on this. I'm just going to show you real quick. This is just a math site. Let me show you this one first. So this is what's known as a hyperbola. And so the speed of light was kind of like it was up here. And then you're going down through history, the time of Adam, the time of Noah, the time of Peleg, and the time of, eventually Abraham. And right around that 2800 to 2500 BC, right around this time period, it started to flatten out. And now it's still slowing down, but it's slowing down very, very minutely because it's reached the bottom of the curve. And so if you want to look at it, it's known here as a cosecant sine squared wave. And so if you look at this formula for that type of wave, it's the red one that you see here. And so if you see that red one, you can see that this measures the ZPE strength in the past to the present has gone up, and as it's gone up, the speed of light has gone down, and it's flattened out now so that it appears, and it appeared for many years to be a constant, but with more precise measurements and the amount of time that's gone by, we can see for sure now, absolute scientific fact proven that it is slowing down, but they are trying to look at the rate by which it's slowing down, and they're extrapolating that now into the past, saying, oh, it's no big deal because, yeah, it's slowing down a little bit, but it's basically been slowing down like this, not a cosecant sine squared wave. It's really more like just this real gradual shift and it's been shifting so minutely that it doesn't even make a big impact or a difference. However, with Barry Setterfield's redshift data, and he's the only one that has adequately explained redshift, that's not the case. It's simply not the case. And so I would highly encourage you to go see, um, and I'll point you in the right direction, and I'll put a link in the description. And I want to show you here, uh, if you want this explained to you with more technical terminology, this is Barry Setterfield's research website. Um, and I would highly recommend watching this Chuck Missler's interview with Barry. I'll put the link in the description of this video. It's an excellent video where, in layman's terms, Chuck Missler is interviewing him, and Barry Setterfield explains everything in layman's terms, so you can very clearly understand it. Excellent, excellent video, and I highly recommend it. So, real quick, getting back to the text here, um, I'm going to suggest to you again that this light is the light of God, which is being manifested into the earth domain in a measured way, so that there would be a balance between the darkness that he imposed to protect us from his unmitigated light and glory, and yet also to give into that shroud of darkness a measure of his light, so that we could have the free will choice to choose whether we wanted to accept light or whether we want to flee to the darkness. So it's one or the other. That's the choice that we have before us. And real quick, I'll show you. This is this is uh, E.W. Bullinger's definitions of the different words used for light in the Scripture. Very important. We're going to get into this more when we get into Genesis 1:14 through 18. But let me just show you real quick. In 14, let there be lights. Notice this. It's a little bit different word. And God said, let there be lights. Notice this. It's a different word, ma'or. Instead of or by itself, it's ma'or, meaning that it's a light bearer or a lamp. So it's not the source of light. God is the source of light. Christ is the source of light. This is a lamp that is shining forth that light or reflecting that light. So ma'or is a light bearer or a lamp, whereas or is underived and pure, the essence, the source, if you will, of light. And so I'll just show you right here. Notice light in Greek. Now that was Hebrew. In Greek, you have phos, which is light, which is underived and absolute. So it's used especially or specifically of God. Like I said in John 1:5, 1 John 1:5, we see that God is light and there is no darkness. Then you have, in Greek, you have phoster. Okay, so you have phos and phoster, and that's the derivative where we get the word photon from. Phoster is a light or a light giver, like a lamp or a light bearer or a light holder. Okay, so you have these different terms for light. So when you're looking in Scripture, very important to take a look and see what you're looking at. Also in Ephesians 5 here we have, but all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light, for whatsoever doth make manifest is light. And so when you see that, we see that God manifests his light into creation, and when we have the light of Christ, because we know in John chapter 1 that it says that Christ is the light, and that the light shined in the darkness, and the darkness didn't understand it or comprehend it, because the darkness is shrouding, people abused it, and they brought darkness to a point of where the darkness hides my actions and my deeds and my motives from everybody, including God. Wrong. God sees right through that, and all motives, all actions, everything that's been done or spoken, thought or said, all of that's going to be exposed by his light at the end. And so there is no hiding from the underived absolute light. The darkness was imposed to give people a free will choice for a time period, for a space of time, to give people a free will choice to decide whether they want to flee to the darkness, to hide their sins, their motives, their carnal nature, or do they want God's light and the blood of Christ to cover our sins and us to embrace His light and embrace His truth? And so that's really what it's all about, and it's all here seen in the first few verses of Genesis. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Okay, so we'll stop there for today. And I hope you enjoyed this session. Hope you're enjoying this series. And this was a long one because there was a lot of details that we had to get into here. But for the most part, I'm going to try to keep most of them, especially when we get into the later chapters, to 30-minute segments, 30 to 40-minute segments. I'll try my best to do that. But this had a lot of meat to it, so I really wanted to get into all the details. So we'll be looking at Genesis 1, 4, and 5 in the next session. Until then, God bless you. I'll see you here, there, or in the air, or in the next video.